So I hope you have enjoyed this conversation with Dan. You have understood that he is a friend, he is also a mentor, but now another great speaker, a star of our field, Amy Edmondson, interviewed by a wonderful moderator. That's why he's not here on stage. Ted, who will introduce Amy Edmondson on a new session on employee engagement, and after we will speak about psychological safety and ethics. So, see you soon.
Hello, everyone. I'm very honored to open up our first session of the Human Advantage Conference about employee engagement with our fantastic speaker, Amy Edmondson. Amy Edmondson is currently the Novartis Professor of Leadership and Management at Harvard Business School. The Novartis Chair was established to enable the study of human interactions that lead to the creation of successful enterprises for the betterment of society. She's best known for her work on the effects of psychological safety on learning and innovation in teams. Professor Edmondson has been recognized by the biannual Thinkers 50 Global Ranking of Management Thinkers since 2011 and was ranked #1 in 2021. Professor Edmondson is author of dozens of articles and 8 books, including the forthcoming Right Kind of Wrong, The Science of Failing Well, and the bestseller, The Fearless Organization, Creating Psychological Safety in the Workplace for Learning, Innovation, and Growth, which has been translated already into 15 languages. Welcome, Amy. A big thank you for agreeing to participate in the Human Advantage Conference.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, Amy, this first session really focuses on employee engagement within organizations. Could you start by explaining your perspective regarding why the vast majority of public or private sector leaders consider employee engagement a key factor for performance, while at the same time, many employees don't necessarily feel so engaged?
Well, I think in the knowledge era where we exist, it's clear. I think it's increasingly clear to people that work is discretionary or effort is discretionary, meaning it is very hard to objectively assess and determine whether and sort of require people to work harder than they are. It's invisible in a sense. The degree to which you're putting your creativity, your heart and soul into the work is utterly discretionary. You can almost think of it as a volunteer effort. And I think people recognize that, and they want people to feel engaged. They want people to care. They want people to really be trying to do the best they can with their colleagues. And that can't be taken for granted.
Yeah. And do you think that's true, Amy, whether I'm working in a corporate, headquarters somewhere in an office park, or whether I'm working at a fulfillment center in a distribution factory? Is it only for us knowledge workers, or is it across the board?
Well, actually, I think most work today is knowledge work, right? Even work that we might think of as more hands-on usually requires a lot of judgment and discretion. So I think it's true. I think it's true for nearly everybody. I mean, let's put it this way. There's very few jobs that are objectively measurable real time, where you can just sort of say real time, is that person, doing the best, or at least a very good rendition of that task. There's always the potential for people to do more, think harder, be more sort of, engaged, more ingenious. So I think it's more or less true for everybody.
And you mentioned in some of your writing that being too focused on the short-term material offerings, things like pay or flexibility, particularly post-COVID, don't necessarily work so well. Could you go deeper into this? Because as an employee, I have Eric here, I have my boss on the line. It's easy to kind of default to those things, right?
Yes.
Tell us more.
Yes, first of all, it's easy to default to those things because they are the easiest to alter. They're material. You can literally make a decision today to change some policy or some pay scale. And they are the least sticky. Let's start with pay. Pay is something that we get accustomed to, and it doesn't motivate per se. I mean, an increase motivates very temporarily, but it's not a long-term motivator in the way that purpose and community and growth and development opportunities are harder to. Well, as we go from the material to the growth and development opportunities to the culture and community and to the purpose, each one gets progressively harder to alter, but more enduring, have a more powerful, longer-term effect. So this is based on work that I've done with Mark Mortensen at INSEAD on what we call an integrated employee value proposition. And all of those categories are ones that have deep literatures associated with them, but they're not frequently looked at together. What is the impact of one on another, and how do they work as an integrated set? And that's what we've been digging into.
I want to dig in a little bit on the idea of flexibility. Obviously, in this kind of, we're all tired of talking about COVID, but in this kind of post-COVID world we're living in, there's oftentimes an expectation of endless flexibility, of always working from home. I'm based in London, and we saw kind of an exodus from the city of people moving far enough away from London that commuting in more than once a week is almost impossible for some people because the life choices that they've made. How do we, as leaders, as employers, how do we provide flexibility that makes people feel that they can, have that work-life balance? And at the same time, I'm thinking of the article in Harvard Business Review of you and Mark's work, also talking about, creating atmosphere for juniors to learn. Tell us a little bit more about how to manage flexibility.
But I think the first thing you have to recognize is what you just said, which is there are relationships and therefore there are trade-offs. And so I can't have ultimate flexibility and deep relationships, right? I'm trading one against the other. And flexibility makes the most sense. I mean, flexibility defined as you can work wherever, whenever you want for tasks that are both individually accomplished and modular, meaning the interfaces with other people's work are uncomplicated. And as soon as you violate, one or the other, that the interfaces are in fact more complicated, that the tasks do have a high level of interdependence, then flexibility is at odds, even not just with sort of relationships, but even with quality of execution. So it's actually, Mark and I advocate just step back and look at the work first, right? What is the nature of the value that we are providing for our customers, and how does that value get produced, right? And if part of your answer to that question is through teamwork, through interdependence, through the integration of people with diverse skill sets and areas of expertise, then we have to give a deep and long thought to what kinds of flexibility work best. So that can't be everybody just doing whatever works for them as individuals, right? It has to, at the very least, being what works for us as a team. Right? And maybe what works for us as a team is some time together, and then, we coordinate, we brainstorm, we get that energy that brings, and then we allocate certain tasks that can be done individually, and off we go, and we can connect electronically as we need to along the way. But whatever the answer is, it has to be at least a team level answer, not an individual level answer.
And I would assume you have some leaders asking you for that perfect combination of how many days do we need to be face to face and how many days can we be remote, and it's so contextual, I assume. But
yeah. Right. It's so specific, and we don't have an answer to how many days, but I think we can say it needs to be thought about, it needs to be experimented with, and it needs to be updated as more is learned.
We've kind of dove in already, but I want to take a step back to what you mentioned before. So, to you, what are those main drivers of employee engagement? You talked about designing and implementing an employee value proposition, which consists of those four integrated or interrelated factors, right? Material offerings, we talked about a little bit. Growth and development opportunities, connection, community, and meaning and purpose. Can you explain, you've kind of touched on it, but how did you come to those 4 areas?
Well, we came to those 4 areas by the sort of existing literature, just taking a look at the kinds of things that have been written about and studied as drivers of employee engagement and retention. And as I said, there are separate literatures on each of these, and the trade-offs between them are less well attended to. But these are all, and that you listed them in the right order, really, from sense the most foundational or material that obviously must be there, but has the least enduring impact, on motivation. And at the top of the pyramid, if you will, is purpose and meaning. And I think all of us long to be doing something that matters, to our colleagues, to the world in some smaller or larger way. And yet, how do you create a sense of deep purpose in people? That's it's not something you do with just a flick of a switch. So there's this sense that the things that are more enduring and powerful are harder to build, but have more lasting value. And then there's the things that sort of easier to change, have less lasting value.
And I've seen, as that's been represented graphically, I've seen the kind of, shorter term to longer term and the kind of more individual to more collective. I have a question for you on a maybe a slightly different measure. Do you see a difference in career stage? For example, almost all those kind of 4 pillars seem quite important when I was a young employee, right? I was really making, I needed money because salaries are lower when you're a junior employee and cost of living is not necessarily lower. Until you have children, et cetera. But also I really needed community and kind of camaraderie at that younger stage, because you're a first jobber. You've kind of left university or a master's program and you really are kind of, maybe meeting your future spouse, et cetera. And now I find kind of mid-career that my needs for community are a little bit different. And also, there's more juniors in a business typically and kind of mid-levels. And the further kind of you get up, you don't necessarily have quite as many contemporaries. Any thoughts on kind of career progression or life stage?
Yeah, I think there are clear implications of what we're talking about for life stage. And that's part of the challenge, is that this whole conversation has to be a conversation about us, right? About the organization, not about the individual. Because on the one hand, people at different career stages, let's say lower level or more junior career stages, you need more mentoring, you need more learning and development, more advancement opportunities. You maybe care more about the material, although that's, I think that's at least malleable in a way that we can talk about. But the problem is, if you care about the enterprise, then you have to care as much about what the junior people need as about what the senior people need or want. And there will be sacrifices, right? And I think in a way over the last decade, maybe more, we've become less comfortable with the idea that I sometimes have to give, not just take, that there will be sacrifices. I won't have my perfect setup all the time for me, because that wouldn't work for you. But I can get pleasure and meaning from knowing that I am helping you, or that I am doing things that are not maybe ideal for my perfect lifestyle, but are helping our enterprise do well in creating the value that we create.
Yeah, because I think, it's easy to think of kind of an old adage like it's lonely at the top, and think that only makes sense for presidents and CEOs. But even within a team, you could be the head of marketing of a not that big business, but you don't necessarily have somebody who's a contemporary. And I think what we find in some of our work is that you can find some kind of lonely souls within an organization at a mid to kind of senior career level who are missing that sense of real community that drives a lot of then the meaning of having contemporaries.
I think that's right. I think that's right, and this is where it's important to reach out to people like maybe in your same role, but in other functions, and build those networks and build those relationships, which also, by the way, help with the sort of cross-silo collaboration that is so essential in most of today's businesses and public sector organizations as well. So yeah.
Coming back to this idea of these 4 factors really being not just integrated, but interdependent, tell us, what are the risks? What could be dangerous of not thinking about all 4 and just, to your point earlier, just kind of really delivering hard on one of the pillars, but maybe neglecting 2 or 3 of the others?
I think what you get, depending on which of the pillars, they have different meanings, but you get long-term consequences that are problematic, right? So if you don't invest enough, for example, an obvious one, in growth and development, over time, the talent pool and skill set that you have in your organization doesn't keep up with the changing needs of the market. And if you start to erode the connections in the community, people just care less. They care less about each other. They care less about what we're doing here together. They're more vulnerable to, let's say, maybe a slight salary increase offered by another organization. Well, why wouldn't I leave? I don't feel any sense of loss or any sense of connectedness to you. If we neglect purpose over time, people just stop. They lose some of that intrinsic motivation to do a good job.
You just mentioned purpose, and I want to talk about that. We've been seeing a lot of our private sector clients coming to us and talking about a brand. Let's particularly say kind of a brand purpose, like where there's a product or a service to be sold that's not necessarily at face value the most purposeful. It's a biscuit, it's a cookie, it's a motor oil, it's a pharmaceutical medication that's, maybe not life-saving, but nice to have. This idea around purpose, any pointers on how to really activate employees to rally around a purpose so that it has meaning? Because work is work, right? And the vast majority of us are spending a large part of our day answering emails, getting back internal project timelines. It's quite easy to feel removed from that purpose. Any pointers?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And sometimes I think the idea that work is work gets lost in this conversation, right? Work is work. It's supposed to be work. It's supposed to be a little bit effortful. And there is some sense of satisfaction from that, right? I worked hard and I saw something happen, or I saw that I made a difference in your life. Now, one of the case studies that Mark and I included in our research was WD-40, which, talk about motor oil, or it's not exactly a sexy product. It's not exactly one that it's not patient care, and yet there are very few organizations with higher engagement and higher sense of mattering to each other, to the world. They've talked themselves into believing that this very ordinary product really matters, is sort of well used in households around the world. And, it's just the sort of almost extreme example. But I think in terms of pointers, I think it's about making sure first that you have a reasonably good answer to the question, why does it matter that this organization exists? And if you truly cannot answer that question, get out of the way, because it's got to matter. And maybe your answer is it matters because these are jobs that affect families and communities of our employees. But I think you can do better than that. I think you must do better than that. Right? There's got to be some answer to the way that your products or services are making people's lives better, right? In some, maybe biscuits, fine, right? It's maybe not the healthiest food to live off all the time, but it can brighten your day or your meal a little bit. But you've got to believe it, you've got to have it, and you've got to help other people see it. Because I think one of the deepest desires in us is the desire to matter. We want to matter to each other, but we also want to matter in some small way to the community.
And when it comes to taking these four pillars into an integrated process or interrelated process, any pointers on how to kind of make that engaging for the long term? We see leaders, we see organizations kind of come in, guns a-blazing, new purpose posted on the wall, get some senior leaders out there to talk about it, and it kind of becomes an event. And how do we make sure that that process lives in the organization so that it actually has, the long-term effect on employee engagement, as opposed to just saying, oh, we all had an afternoon where we, got excited?
Honestly, I don't think there's a perfect answer to that question. I mean, I think it's about it's about setting that stage, as you described, in a variety of ways, and then the constant reinforcement, the constant just feelings of and experiences of connection, the reinforcement, the reminding of why we're glad you're here, right? Why we're glad you're here, and what it is we're doing together, and inspiring people to want to do it better. We're doing the best, we're doing what we are doing today, and we're excited about finding ways to do it better.
Amy, obviously, we've been talking a lot about employee engagement, but I want to also kind of turn back a page on your career to what probably most of our audience maybe know you most for, which is really this concept of psychological safety. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this concept yet or who haven't read your work yet, how would you define psychological safety for our audience?
As a belief that the context is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. And by interpersonal risk-taking, I mean behaviors such as speaking up with an idea, admitting a mistake, asking for help, and even experimenting, right? Experimenting. So these are all behaviors that I think you readily recognize as learning behaviors, your own and for others. And yet they bring interpersonal risk. Each one of them brings the risk, small or large, that others might think less of you for them. And most of us will spontaneously hold back, right? It's just much easier to be quiet than to speak up. So it's natural to hold back. And yet that puts our team and ultimately our organizations at risk. So psychological safety describes an environment where people feel not that it's easy to take these risks, but that it's expected, right? That it's expected.
So beyond possible, it's expected. Okay.
It's expected, right? It's sort of what we do because of what's at stake, right? Because we care enough to take interpersonal risks so that, our customers don't experience those risks or our colleagues don't experience those risks. I mean, there's an immediate and obvious relationship between psychological safety and employee safety, right? If people are not speaking up about small hazards or challenging someone doing an unsafe action, for example, people get hurt, right? And so it's, it's most of the complex, uncertain things that happen could have, and especially the ones that lead to failures, could have been prevented had people felt more able to speak up.
To do so. And I'm going to ask you kind of a double-barreled question. Do you have any idea of the kind of proportion of organizations where you think employees actually are experiencing psychological safety? That's kind of question number one. And question number two is, do you think there are any particular sectors or industries that do a better job of creating psychological safety?
Well, I think the answer to the first question is no. I don't have systematic data, but my intuition is that psychological safety is difficult and therefore more rare than not, right? I mean, really creating environments of candor and learning and, holding each other to account in various ways are not the norm, certainly in most workplaces. So I think it's best to assume it's not there and be constantly working to help build it. Now you're going to have to remind me the second question.
And the second question is, are there any industries or sectors where you feel do a better job of creating psychological safety?
I think, well, again, I don't know of any industry or sector that's uniformly good at it, but I think there's been a great deal of attention to psychological safety in healthcare delivery over the last 15 years, especially the last I'd say 5 years. It's just a lot of attention, a lot of recognition that this really matters. It is also true in high hazard industries, aviation, passenger air travel, energy, oil, where there's a lot of opportunity for people to get hurt. There's been more attention to making sure you have an environment where people are not holding back.
Yeah, I know our team at PVA Nudge Consulting in France has worked with a nuclear power company, which the first objective set by the client was to reduce workplace accidents. But of course, we utilize some of your work to also say within that psychological safety for someone to say, I know you have an important visitor, but that visitor is not complying with, whatever they need to be wearing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Making status go away, hierarchy go away in the service of safety, and that's very consistent with psychological safety.
And that makes me think. I'm American, like yourself, and I'm based in London now, but I spent 15 years of my career in East Asia, and I'm also thinking there's a real element of cultural context around psychological safety that in some of the countries and in some of the organizations in some of the countries where I have either worked or been a consultant to, speaking up is really different because of hierarchy, because of cultural norms. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, it's an issue that comes up a lot, and the short answer is yes. There are cultural differences, and hierarchy is taken more seriously in some cultures than others. That's a given, and yet the work itself doesn't vary very much, right? Meaning that the need for psychological safety is just as great whether you're in Asia or in London or in the United States, right? It's the modern economy is requiring more speed, more candor, more problem solving, more ingenuity. Therefore, you have your work cut out for you, perhaps more fully.
And from your observations of various sectors and let's say the marketplace more broadly, is psychological safety on the minds of leaders, or does it sometimes need to be reframed as better retention or better attraction of talent or better team success or higher rates of innovation success? Is the marketplace motivated by psychological safety, or is it our job as kind of appliers to do some framing there?
I think it is rarely motivated by psychological safety. And frankly, that's okay. But because to me, psychological safety isn't the goal. It's sort of the means to an end. If you want to be a learning organization, by which I mean innovative, adaptive, flexible, able to keep adapting to the challenges out there, I think you need psychological safety. And I think, there's growing recognition of that, but there's also, as you can imagine, many areas of misunderstanding, where psychological safety is seen as, comfort or job security or, happiness. And it's not those things, right? It's in fact, it's hard. Psychological safety is challenging because learning is challenging. Most of us will spontaneously choose being comfortable over learning, right? Learning's hard, but we need to choose learning both for ourselves and for our teams and organizations. So higher awareness, but also misunderstandings. And the motivation generally doesn't come from psychological safety or becoming a psychologically safe environment. The motivation comes from we want to be an excellent organization that's competing effectively in a challenging marketplace.
Right. In our audience at the Human Advantage, Amy, we have practitioners and business leaders, and we'll go into details in a moment with Antoine on discuss that Novartis case. But can you share any kind of process you recommend to a leader to successfully strengthen psychological safety within their organization? There are kind of one or two kind of hot tips to, from the top that can help them create or start to create a momentum towards psychological safety.
Yeah, I think the number one is to just call attention to the nature of the work in today's world, right? Just call attention to things like the magnitude of the challenge, the level of uncertainty, the desire for, creativity and input. When you are actively saying, we can't do this without your brains in the game, that's sort of job one. And with that messaging is a real demonstrated humility, right? Which is it's not false modesty, it's humility. Like, I don't have all the answers. We don't even have all the answers, but working together, I'm confident that we can make amazing things happen, right? So it's a kind of humility to say aloud what we don't know, why it's challenging, and then a proactive drawing in of people's voices and ideas. I need to hear from you. I'm excited about what we can do together. Right? So it's a lot about messaging, and then of course setting up structures and systems that make that possible. Right? If I say I really need to hear from you, we need to work together, we've got to have systems and structures that allow us to do just that.
Amy, I know we're coming to the end of this first initial conversation, but we can't let you go without speaking about your new book, The Right Kind of Wrong, The Science of Failing Well, which has just been released at the beginning of this month. I'd like to create some curiosity and interest for your book. Can you tell us the purpose of this book versus some of your past writing? What do we need to be reading?
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, it certainly builds on psychological safety, but the idea here is that there's almost two camps, right? There's the fail fast, fail often camp that says, hey, failure is this great thing. You should have a failure resume. You should have a failure party. And then there's the other side saying, wait just a minute. I live in the real world. And in fact, we can't fail over here. And of course, they're both right and they're both wrong. And neither one is very nuanced. So the point of the book is to say there are different kinds of failure. Only some, which I call intelligent failures, are good. They are in new territory, hypothesis driven, as small as possible, and in pursuit of a goal. And those are the kinds of failures we need not fewer of, but more of. And we need to learn how to embrace them. And we need to do best practices for reducing basic failures and complex failures. And there's plenty of information about that too. But I suppose none of this can happen absent psychological safety, for speaking up to prevent preventable failures, but also for raising wild ideas and experimenting. I talk about elite failure practitioners as, inventors and scientists and celebrity chefs and elite athletes, the people who understand deeply that failure is necessary toward great success. And I'm trying to help all of us, everybody dance a little bit more lightheartedly with failure of the good kind.
But I think that's that distinction is important, because I think that kind of fail fast, fail often has become a slightly trite mantra when people don't actually really mean it all the time.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. And then you've got this sort of awkward thing of double speak. You're saying a message you can't really believe. And of course you can't, because it's not nuanced enough.
Fail fast, fail often, but really make sure there's some winners in there as well. It's like, well,
right.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
And that's the point. If you fail well, you will, in fact, be producing the knowledge you need for the next experiment to go better. And eventually, and often quickly, you'll get to some, astonishing new idea, product, service.
Music to my ears. I'm a bit of an anti-fail fast, fail often. And also, what you say also is around experimenting. I think that's what's so important as we work with both public and private, sector organizations, is that applying behavioral science, applying, these principles is really science. It's not magic. It's not alchemy, nor is innovation is not magic or alchemy. We really need to build in that desire to experiment and test.
See, that's really where it starts and where it ends. It's about experimenting. We've got to be comfortable experimenting. It's spontaneously uncomfortable, but we can get more comfortable with it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Amy. We really highly recommend that our attendees read any of your insightful books, but of course, the newest one coming out now. A big thank you for this first conversation, and excited to have the next one with Antoine.
Thank you, Ted. It was great speaking with you.
Thanks so much.
So, as you could hear me allude to in the conversation with Amy, we're going to carry on this topic of around employee engagement. That was really the theory, the kind of thinking behind it, and now we want to see it applied in a real case. So, next up is fostering psychological safety in teams, the why, the what, and the how. This is a quick case from Novartis with Professor Amy Edmondson, who you've just met, and Antoine Ferret. Eric will be leading that one, so you'll hear him introduce this topic in just a minute.
Hello again, everyone. I am now excited to host our panel discussion, Fostering Psychological Safety in Teams, Why, What and How, the Novartis Case. And I have the pleasure of being the moderator of this fantastic roundtable. By now, I think you are familiar with Professor Amy Edmondson and had the pleasure of hearing her talk. Now we will delve into a concrete application at Novartis. So let me start by introducing our second panelist, my friend Antoine Ferrer. Antoine is a global head of behavioral and data science, ethics, compliance. So that's a lot. You will have a lot to share with us, Antoine, I'm sure. Antoine is a recognized behavioral scientist and an expert in organizational transformation. He is a published author, and I do recommend his articles, and a fond amateur actor, as he regularly performs in Basel Theatre. That may be why he is a so good and engaging speaker, as I think you will soon discover. I know it because he was part of our Human Advantage Conference last year already. So welcome, Amy, and welcome, Antoine.
Nice to be here, Eric, and with you, Amy. And you certainly raised the expectation right away. So
yeah, very high expectation. So, and my objective is very clear today. As I mentioned, to delve into the core aspect of the research, the practical for our audience implication for organization, and the real-world challenges and solutions in promoting ethical behavior, which is your purpose, and psychological safety within workplaces. So maybe I would like to start with you, Antoine, for a first question about the context of this research. What inspired your research on fostering ethical conduct through psychological safety, which is, I think, quite innovative, but we will know more after with Amy perspective. Why did you feel this topic was important to explore? And why psychological safety in relation with this topic?
Thanks, Eric. And that's certainly an excellent question to kick us off. And funny enough, as Amy, we initially didn't actually set to work on psychological safety, right? There wasn't one of the goals that we had, that we have to do something with psychological safety. The context and the problem was slightly different. It was then close 4 years ago already. And then we were, as a company, Novartis, in the midst of a cultural transformation, and in particular with the creation of the new ethics, risk and compliance department, where we wanted to look at our code of conduct and, the code of ethics. And we wanted to find new ways and innovative ways of making sure all associates around the world do what's right. And so we're in the middle of like a new code of ethics launch. And then I was brought in as a behavioral scientist to try to understand what can we do compared to traditional approach to make sure people do the right thing, even if when that's the right hard thing to do. And then from there, we started to ask a couple of questions, which is, nice, you want to roll out that code of ethics, but what behaviors do you want to change? What actual problem are you trying to solve for? Right. And then, we started to pull the thread there. Oh, yeah, we want people to behave ethically. Okay, sure. Across 100 countries, 400,000 people. Right. What kind of evidence and data do we have about ethical or unethical behavior in the organization? Right. And so we started to look at this, and then we realized we have a lot, but we don't have anything solid in terms of understanding not only what are actual unethical or ethical behavior, but also what are the drivers of the ethical behaviors, unethical behavior, the ethical climate. And so this is when we turned into, the established science, and we look at what are the drivers of ethical behavior, what are the derailers. And there was many things in there, and I'm sure we'll come back to that, organizational justice, sense of fairness, sense of agency, loyalty, goal conflict, and psychological safety. There was a good intuition there, right? Seems to be logical. Say, well, maybe it probably is a good thing for people to be and just be able to just be themselves and say what they think when it comes to ethics, right? If you assume people have a good ethical base, maybe you want them to carry that through and bring their whole ethical self to work. So that's how we sort of made sure that psychological safety as a psychological construct was one of the key things we measured with the global baseline survey that we launched, right, in Novartis in 2021. That's how we came to psychological safety as one of the many ingredients in the behavioral ethics recipe, put it this way. That makes sense.
Thanks a lot. Good intro. Amy, were you surprised when Antoine contacted you to conduct research on psychological safety in relation to ethics?
I wish I could say yes, but I think it's a very natural connection, at least from my perspective. From where I come from, it makes perfect sense to at least ask the question of how comfortable are people in speaking up, because when people are not comfortable speaking up, ethical behavior is more at risk. So what we looked at was really whether that was, that seems logical, right? But whether the data supported that idea that when people felt more able to speak up about risky things in general, but say few things are as risky to speak up about as a perceived violation of ethics on the part of someone else, that ought to be a relationship that exists in the data, and indeed it did. So to back up and just talk about this conceptually, when people feel enabled to speak up with questions or concerns, and especially in a kind of early way, that often allows the prevention of more consequential problems, including, if not especially, unethical behavior.
Mm-hmm. So for you, from the very beginning, you were persuaded that it was relevant to study ethics and to better understand ethics with this concept of psychological safety.
Yes, indeed. And I thought it was exciting to have the chance to do that with Antoine's colleagues. He's got an amazing team of data scientists who are just really thoughtful and curious and smart, and so it was a great opportunity to collaborate.
That's very kind, Amy. And then, to pick up on the theme of, I think I'm sure we'll come back to that maybe, and if not, at least I just want to, underline that point that, yeah, it seems to be very intuitive, right? In a way, a lot of the research that we've done is really, once you know the result and you have proof of that, you're going to go back and say, well, yeah, that doesn't sound really groundbreaking, right? It's a bit like if you leave the window open in the winter, it's going to get colder. Sure. Well, hold on, because it's one thing to know that. It's the other to know, hold on, how do I get the window closed? What's the, or if I put fuel in my car, you start driving, hold on, what kind of fuel, where, when? So it's all about how do you actually, to your point, Eric, in the intro of that conversation, it's about what can we do precisely about this and what evidence do we have? Because of course, from the high level, it's kind of seems natural. It seems to be the right thing. But the key difference is having enough evidence to be able to design intervention. And I think that was a real sort of angle we tried to take.
Yeah. Antoine, now I think it's very important for our audience to understand this study very concretely before we start talking about the results and from the result, what we can do to ensure the relevant behavior in relation with ethics. So could you describe this study very concretely? What was the objective? Who were the participants? What were the main questions asked? And how did you work with Amy regarding all these key elements?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So maybe, Amy, I'll take a stab and then you jump in because you were involved from the beginning. So basically, as I've said, we had this idea and there was, then supported by the sponsorship in the organization to say, hey, we got to establish a baseline of the state of ethics in the organization. And there's many ways to do that, but one of the ways is to get into people perception of what is the ethical climate, what are the things around them, because we know as behavioral scientists, it is very close to the reality, because those perceptions that drive behaviors, right? There's no such thing as what's the objective reality of the ethical climate. Well, it's about how people feel about it, largely. So that's why, exactly. That was a good instrument for. It's not a poor proxy for measuring something. In that case, it's like very good instrument. So we designed a global survey in Novartis. That very extensive for such a corporate survey, I would say. So that has about 60 questions, plus or minus, with all the different branching. And then the audience for the survey was everybody working in Novartis, internal and then long-term external. So that was about, at that time, 150,000 people. So large number of people, translated in 15 languages. You can imagine all the logistics around that. But that was sort of the scope. And then within the survey, importantly, and then Amy could also talk to that. There's sort of two key parts of the survey. One is about let's go back the chain of causality and look at the drivers, derailers, determinants, things that are important in terms of psychology that tend to be related, associated with behaviors, right? So psychological safety was one thing that we realized, okay, we could have this. I mentioned a few others: goal conflict, sense of control or agency. We had loyalty as a construct at the beginning, which we dropped because it wasn't really having any effect. Fairness and trust, well-being. So all the things that kind of define what it feels to be working in the organization, right? Loosely, that's what that is. And so that's one side of the survey, which is using established scale where we can for those constraints by slightly dropping maybe a couple of items, simplifying because we got to fit the corporate constraint. And this is where we work with Amy to look at the original scale that you developed, Amy, the 6-point scale. And then we adjusted one of the questions, I believe, right? We dropped one of them, replaced, so we could, make it even more fit for the purpose that we had. And then briefly, the other side of the survey, of the study, was then perceived behaviors, perceived outcomes. So it would go like this, right? So you being asked a bunch of questions about how you feel about certain things, of course, in a smart way, not directly, right? Something in a way that is robust. And then there will be a question about, okay, in the last 12 months, in the last 6 months, how many times did you see something that you felt was unethical? 0, 1, 2, whatever. Okay, you saw something. Okay, what kind of category was this? How would you categorize it in a very layman term? What did you do? Did you speak about it? Okay, to whom? Oh, to your manager. How did he or she react? How did he make you feel? So then we pull the thread about what people do when they see something, to who they speak, who they feel, do they feel it's resolved? And that's the whole survey. And then you can imagine, we'll get into the research we've done, then you can compare within the survey, on the left side, the levers that you have and the component of the ethical culture to the outcome within the survey about what people say they see, what people say they do, what people say they feel, right? So that's really basically the setup of the way we generated evidence to be able to say something meaningful in that case about psychological safety and speak up behaviors and how people feel about that, and ethical behavior in general as well, as we know, right? So, Amy, anything you want to add there that I might have glossed over?
No, I think that's wonderfully detailed, and I want to emphasize again this notion that the perception of ethical climate is ethical climate, right? That's so important. It's the same for psychological safety. Perception of psychological safety is psychological safety, right? If you don't believe it's acceptable to speak up, that effectively shapes your behavior, because you're not going to do it. You're not, people don't sort of deliberately engage in behaviors that they think will harm themselves. And what I did think was particularly special about this study was the sort of asking concretely, did you see something unethical? Did you speak up about it? Right? There's there was some really sort of robust metrics there about behaviors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very clear. I think now the study itself is very clear. Antoine, before we go into the detail for some very important, I think, output results, could you describe again for our audience the, let's say, 3 main results?
Thanks. So you've had to pick like 3 of them, or a handful of them. I think the first one, the very basic one, right? The on the face of it is that psychological safety is key in defining what's the, I don't know, you want to call that, the ethical culture and ethical climate. And it is because, as we saw in the research, it is really closely associated to other elements that are important within an ethical culture or culture in general, sense of fairness, goal conflict. It is almost very central, right? It's something that is really across. So that's the most basic fact, which is, it is really associated with all those other things that are important here in terms of establishing a good ethical culture, to speak narrowly about ethics here, right? So that would be the first thing. It matters for ethical climate. The second thing that's more, let's say, narrowly related to the objective of the research, or at least the topic of the research that we published with Amy, is, and that's where it seems intuitive, but it was really heartening to see that in the data. It's just the more safe somebody in a team feels psychologically, the more likely it seems, or the more associated it is with speaking up in useful ways, right? So the more psychologically safe somebody is, then the more likely he or she is to say something about something that they saw that they felt was unethical. More precisely, it's not just say it in different ways, it's say something in a way that is useful for an organization, so they can act on something, which means going to your manager, speaking to HR, going to legal or your compliance department. And the less safe people were psychologically, then the more likely they were to keep things for themselves, speak to family and friends, which is probably the worst for an organization, right? And so that was a beautiful, let's say, association there. Of course, correlation is not causation. We're talking about within a cross-sectional survey, right? So although we run regressions, it is not pure, real causation, but it is associated, and then you can guess about the sense of the directionality of causation. So that's the second one. The third one, which maybe is less linked directly with psychological safety, but to me was really important, and it is still today in terms of how I talk to different leaders in the parties, is when it comes to psychological safety, when it comes to actually speaking up about things, yes, top management is important. Yes, you want to have the tone from the top. Yes, you want to have the global webcast. You want to have integrity in one of your values. You want to have code of ethics. But it's all about the first line manager, the person who's managing you. Because what we saw is that when people choose to say something about ethical behavior or unethical behavior, when they choose to say something, 80% of the time, they go to their managers, right? That's the thing that they do. And so the question becomes, okay, how do we equip those people to shape the culture, to make sure people feel safe? Because they are the first port of call. So I think those are the three, from my side. I mean, there's many other insights, but the three key insights that can resonate with, and you're able to do something with that in the organization, especially the last one. That's a good call to action for managers, right? Here's what it means to be ethical, right? It's more than just talking about ethics, is making sure you react accordingly when somebody comes to you, right? It's doing the right thing when it's the hard thing. Somebody brings me a problem. What do I do? What's a natural thing to say? Oh, don't worry about it. No. What do you do, right? So it's not easy, but it's, that's the three things. Amy, do you want to, is there anything?
Yes, I agree, of course, wholeheartedly with all three of the reasons. But the third one is one that I'll double down on because it's so consistent with other research. It's what we find in just not ethical climate, but research on psychological safety climate, is that the variance really lives at the group level, right? That within even, say, a large organization like Novartis, we see real differences across groups. So that implies, and I think it's consistent with the empirics, that the top matters but isn't 100% determinative, of course. And it really does put, the data really shine the light on the leaders in the middle, the frontline managers, the project managers, the team leaders, the country managers. I mean, it depends on the size of the entity, but we look very much as human beings, we look very much to the local leader, the sort of most proximal source of authority and status, as the climate shaper, our social construction of what's true, what's acceptable, is far more influenced by the people that we can sort of see and interact with than by the more distal influence at the top.
Mm-hmm. And Amy, what has surprised you in the results, if something, and what was more a confirmation coming from after a lot of studies you have conducted?
I think the results, it's like Antoine said, in retrospect, I think much good research has this quality that in retrospect it seems somewhat obvious, and it's still reassuring and valuable to have some empirical support for something that seems to make sense. So I would say, I'm not sure there was much that was surprising, but it was delighting, if that's a word, right? It was delighting because to see the real associations between people's reported not only willingness to speak up, but their actual actions that they were taking. That was something that varied, and that varied in sensible ways based on local climate, is pretty important, I think. And it does suggest that the action has to be, as Antoine said before, in shaping the behaviors and the skills. I really want to double down on this idea of skills of the managers. Anyone in a people management role or project management role of any kind, they need serious interpersonal skill, the skill to react thoughtfully to a surprise, to something that's unpleasant or unexpected, and they need to really embrace that input, with a spirit of curiosity and willingness to do the right thing, kind of learning oriented, development oriented. When in their, they would far prefer to know that things are just going along as they should.
Eric, maybe if I may, there's one thing I think that is worth mentioning. I don't know if that would be surprising, but something that gave us pause and is that there was like two, let's say, two set of logical association, right? One was like the more psychologically safe somebody is in a team, the more likely he or she is to raise problems or take basically interpersonal risk by doing so, right? But equally then, the other association that I don't know if I can say was stronger, I can't really put those like statistical word there, but it was equally in the graph at least, speaking of non-scientist, the slope was big, was the association between the amount or the volume of unethical behavior or perceived unethical behavior being reported in a given group and the level of psychological safety. And I say that in that order because we can assume that it's that sense of direction of causality, right? And that was also worrying, which is, again, in areas where that seemed to be more, let's say, toxic or less ethical, then you had de facto less psychological safety. So where you need most psychological safety for people to say something, this is where you had naturally the least, right? So there's a bit of a catch-22, right? Because then it also segue into what can we do? And it shows you that if you treat the organization the same way by having like global psychological safety training webinars, then the one that needs the most will benefit the least. And I'm sure we'll come back to that at some point, talking about the following up experiment we've run as well. But I think that was something that, make us pause a little bit that, okay, where we need the most is where we are the least by default, right?
Right.
Yeah.
It reminds me of a phenomenon that Chris Argyris, one of my mentors, identified of self-sealing dynamics, right? And those who are, most in need of learning, maybe most walled off from it because they're most at, they feel themselves to be most at risk if they're not already, perfect or seen in a good light.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Amy, the research highlight, and I think Antoine has just mentioned this, the role of line manager in creating a safe environment for discussing, in this case, ethical concern. How can organization, from your point of view, empower line manager to play this critical role in an effective way?
I think that it's a combination of training and empowering. You used the word empower already, but what does that mean? It really means just giving permission and over and over reminding people this is in your role. Your role. You are allowed uh, to take this on. You are requested to be curious and asking people what they're seeing. You are and give them sort of training and support and having the most productive learning oriented response possible, because the worst thing that can happen is someone takes the messaging seriously, they speak up honestly about a problem or a concern or an ethical concern they have, and they get shut down, right? Because there's an asymmetry there. You take that risk once, you won't take it a second time. Almost a single harsh negative response to a courageous act is enough to have that not happen again for a very long time, if ever. So providing people with the training to have a thoughtful response is really important, but also the empowering, the sending of the message that this is your job and it matters.
Yeah, no, I think it is absolutely critical. Amy, there is something which was, I think, very interesting in this research. A study revealed that psychological safety is not uniform across different regions. Was it surprising for you, or more a confirmation and something you have already observed in other studies?
It was more confirmation than surprising. Right? This is something that's widely discussed in an informal sense, that there are differences in sort of perceived appropriateness of speaking up across cultures, and I would say our data were quite consistent with those expectations. Still, it's very powerful to have that kind of robust data. And now, what do you do with that finding, right? What do you do with the finding that says you may have higher hurdles to climb in some cultures than others? My answer is you roll up your sleeves and get to work, because you don't have the option of saying, oh, it's harder here, so we'll do less of it. No. In fact, if it's harder here, we have to work on it even more, steadfastly, because of what's at stake. And what's at stake is everything from worker safety to ethical conduct to, production and innovation and excellence more broadly. So I think it helps people understand what they're up against, but it doesn't mean you can't build a tremendous learning-oriented, candid culture within the four walls of your organization that is not violating, but not necessarily perfectly mirroring the external culture.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So it's raised another challenge, which is dealing with different situations. We know in behavioral science we are used to say that context matters a lot. I think in psychological safety, context matters a lot, and solution has to be tailored to be efficient, taking into account this situation and context. Antoine, you mentioned the importance of cross-functional collaboration between the ethics, risk, and compliance function and HR in building a culture of ethics and performance. Could you elaborate and tell us more about this?
Thanks. I think this is really something really important. I mean, here we talk about ethics, risk, and compliance and HR, but it's important all across the organization to collaborate across the silos. We all recognize that. Here, I think the simplest way to explain as to why that is important, if we look at, let's say, social science and behavioral science, is to say that those drivers and derailers of behaviors, they don't stop at the border of a department before they cross to another department. They are shared universally across all the functions. And so if you want to effectively work with sense of fairness, if you want to work with psychological safety, if you want to work with goal conflict, it's not a, a function might be leading, let's say, the charge in designing, but it would only work if it's lending in terms of how people experience it, right? If you want to change how people experience things, not just talk about it, then you have to make sure it reflects in the reality of the processes, the system, the day-to-day, which is then owned by many different functions, right? So as soon as you go to the sort of behavioral space, then it's clear that it doesn't sit in one function, right? And so that's why here we, in Novartis, it's called people and organization. We realize that is critical for us to work with them because, basically, if you look at what is a good ethical culture, it's largely a good culture. What is good ethical leadership? It's largely good leadership, right? First line managers, 80% of people that choose to speak up go to them. How do we equip them? That is not an ethics, risk, and compliance. That is actually nobody's function. Somebody's going to help drive this, but it must be a collaboration, right? Otherwise, it's doomed to fail. And so that's why it is so important. And that's what we do in Novartis. We collaborate not only with P&O, but also across functions to make sure that whatever we try to do, whatever behaviors we try to drive, it is reflected into how people experience it in the day-to-day. Which involves influencing, changing process, policy systems that are owned by different people. Really.
And we know, again, from past research from Amy, that you talk about in teaming, for example, that cooperation is absolutely critical and psychological safety is critical to encourage cooperation.
Yes, it's absolutely critical. And in fact, collaboration or teamwork was my original sort of focus and why psychological safety emerged as an absolutely crucial attribute of effective collaboration. And in more recent years, since that original work, I began to get interested in this problem of cross-functional collaboration and collaborating at the interfaces between areas of expertise as well as between functional groups, country groups. And I could go on all day, but I won't, about the barriers to collaboration. Right? They are based on incentives. They're based on just misunderstanding each other, problems communicating with each other. In a way, you could boil those down to the challenges of learning from one another when we come from different groups. But if we want to get anything done, particularly anything innovative done, we have to do it. And psychological safety plays a crucial role in making that happen. But so does slowing down the conversation to sort of double check that we're understanding each other on the words we use can mean very different things in different groups. So it's probably not an overstatement to say that the success of most modern organizations depends on effective cross-functional collaboration. And it's also not an overstatement to say that's really challenging. So what does that mean? That means we need a lot of leadership, a lot of skill building, and definitely a lot of psychological safety.
Last question, because unfortunately we are already at the end of our conversation. It was an absolutely great one. Antoine, and what about the action? Because when we have understood correlation, explanation, drivers, and so on, what could we do to encourage ethics?
I'm really glad we still have another 45 minutes for this.
You don't.
Oh, okay. So in a nutshell, as we say, if we take a step back from that original initial sort of study, say evidence gathering exercise we've done with the survey, and also looking at these, reconfirming in a way the importance of psychological safety, then what we did the following year is then we realized, okay, psychological safety is really critical for us in terms of driving the right kind of speak-up behavior in the organization, right? And here's the level at which different teams are across the organization. And it is important for not just ethics, but as we know, for a lot of other desirable outcomes performance, sense of progress, many things, right? And so then the action was to say, okay, once we try to educate people about why it's important, as we discussed in terms of the role of the first line manager, we also try to find ways to increase psychological safety, right? How do you increase psychological safety? And then, as Amy knows, we run a large-scale randomized controlled trial in Sandoz, a division of Novartis, and we try to find ways, very simple ways of nudging managers into conducting their team meetings a bit differently in a way that raises psychological safety. And it was just a simple email intervention. And we found ways, substantially to increase how people felt and whether in turn they were more likely to say something when they saw something, be it something unethical, be it that was a bad brand ideas, be it something entirely different, right? And so equipped, let's say, with the initial evidence, then you can find ways that are cheap, that are not complicated, to actually act and try to move that lever in a certain direction, right? And so the question then becomes, you do that pilot, and then you can then try to scale and transform. The message here in closing from my side is just two things here in terms of the actionability. One, through that whole set of research, we learned and we confirmed that there's a way of increasing psychological safety without talking about psychological safety at large to all your employees. You can, you don't necessarily need to. You want them to experience it. They don't need to know about psychological safety. You might need to know in terms of people designing the policies, but the people actually working day in, day out, they don't necessarily need to, right? So that is really important.
I'm going to start with what you just said, Antoine, and say, I actually think it might be better advice not to talk about psychological safety, at least in terms of, I'm not saying it should be off limits, but at least in terms of framing what you're trying to do, right? I think it's actually more powerful to frame it in another way. And my current favorite framing is, it is absolutely crucial that people have high quality conversations, right? In an uncertain world, we need to have high quality conversations to make good decisions, to develop people, to connect with customers, you name it. We need to have high quality conversations. And I think the three sort of action items are, first of all, emphasize how important this is. Secondly, emphasize how difficult it is. I think we tend to think of this as something, well, of course we can do this. We're adults, we can have conversations. No. High quality conversations where we're using evidence and engaging in advocacy and inquiry and walking down the ladder of inference and, really just trying to understand each other in a way that both of us or all of us are learning as we go. Those are highly skilled, highly rare. So they matter, they're difficult, and then offer support for developing those skills because of what's at stake.
You're right. I mean, we don't need to, we maybe shouldn't talk about not just psychological safety, but all the concept we want to push for the organization as concept. Let's put it this way, right? But equally, the other thing that I think is really important, because this is, a conference on behavioral science, right? And so sometimes people look at behavioral science and say, oh, another tool in a box. I can use that. When do I use this? When do I not use this? Here's this magic wand here, and that they can do some nudges and something's going to happen. What it reflects here, the whole experience we've had with that theme is, when we did the randomized control trial, we managed to increase psychological safety for different teams with different intervention by, I think it was in between 9 to 20%. It might be small, it's not that small, but it might feel, it doesn't, feel like, wow, all this for that. But I think when it comes to, especially this kind of difficult thing, culture transformation, it's all about marginal gains that accumulate over time that you can measure. I think in larger corporate organization, we have a bias towards transformation. We want to transform this, we want to transform that. And imagine it's a bit like we're trying to find the 4 aces in the deck of cards, and our strategy is to say, we're going to shuffle the deck. And then, oh, no, still not the aces. You want to take one card at a time. It's a bit slow, it's a bit long, but it works. And I think the scientific approach is about that, right? It's not about transforming. It's not about, sometimes you have to transform, yes, but it's about slow marginal gains. And in that space as well, I'm sure you'll agree, Amy, it's better to increase 5% a month, 5% a year, measurable way, instead of launching a whole new campaign and then nothing happens. So I think that's something that is really close to the approach that we should take and that we try to take here.
We should not downplay the importance of continuous improvement by any stretch, right? And a small difference in psychological safety might just lead to a shared idea or concern that otherwise would not have been shared, and that in itself might have huge implications.
Mm-hmm. Maybe a very last word for you, Amy. We know, thanks to your work, how psychological safety is important for team success, for innovation, for learning. Now we have just understood why it is so important for ethics. We have a lot of leaders in our audience. Could you give one piece of advice for leaders who would like to start reinforcing psychological safety in their organization?
Be humble, be curious. So, and that sounds like two things, but I think they go very nicely together. So humble is the humility to know that you're a fallible human being working with and among other fallible human beings. Things will go wrong. People will make judgment errors and lapses. And so we just take that as a given. And then instead of being sort of punitive and angry about that, get curious about why it happens. And that curiosity gives you much more of the scientific mindset that I think you need to make a difference.
So thanks a lot. Thanks, Antoine. Thanks a lot, Amy. I think it was a wonderful conversation, and it was great to have you at the Human Advantage Conference.